third day in the month of August 2026. Good evening to you. My name is Yagazie, and I'm here because it's time for us again to tell stories to counter polarization in Nigeria. Storytelling for Unity campaign brought to you by the Active Citizen Project with support from Ford Foundation. The mission here is to counter polarization and rebuild civic cohesion. We're here to weigh polarization's effect on our civic cohesion and try to foster cross-ethnic cooperation as much as we can. So if you joined us last week, we began this conversation. It's a six-part series of conversations on this radio, 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. Apologies for starting a tad bit late this evening. All right, if you followed us last Thursday, we had a conversation on the political economy of polarization, try to define what polarization really is and how it affects, citizenship, how people see themselves in a country like ours, Nigeria. Polarization in Nigeria is deep social, political, and economic divisions that separates the population into, opposing groups based on ethnicity, religion, region, wealth, and all whatnot. So we are trying to foster cohesion to make sure that those things that separate us are obliterated, literally. On today's episode, we will try to understand polarization in Nigeria, and we'll be looking at how historical events and collective memories shape Igbo identity and belonging, how historical events and collective memories shape Igbo identity and belonging. So yeah, this conversation sits at the intersection of history, of identity, of memory and belonging. And of course, it's all about nation building. Nigeria is a country of more than 250 ethnic groups, hundreds of languages, different religious traditions, and very different historical experiences. And yet, despite all of these differences, we continue to ask ourselves one fundamental question: What does it really mean, actually, to belong to Nigeria? We all know the stories our parents told us, the stories our grandparents told us, the stories contained in our literature, in our music, in our art. They help in understanding of our past and can influence how we see ourselves in this country. So the history of Ndibo, particularly within the Nigerian project, has been shaped by enormous social and political events, from colonialism and independence to the Nigerian Civil War, the Biafra experience, and then, the aftermath of Biafra, the difficult process of rebuilding and reintegration after the war, which many Igbo people still, carry with them as stories that have been told, like I said, by our parents, by our grandparents, by the literature and the arts that we have. So today we will try to understand polarization in Nigeria and how historical events and collective memories shape identity, particularly for Ndibo. Join us this evening for this conversation. At some point, we'll get you in to share your thoughts, to ask questions. We have a resource person in-house who will be helping us delve deep into this conversation. So yes, join me to welcome, ladies and gentlemen, the Pioneer Director General of the Office for Strategic Preparedness and Resilience, OSPRE, and Nigeria's National Early Warning Center in the Office of the Vice President. The agency is an affiliate of the ECOWAS Regional Peace and Security Architecture and is mandated to address threats to human security. Mr. Chris Ngwodo, good evening, sir. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Good evening to you. Yes, we've been talking about polarization, and the idea is to counter, narratives that continue to engender polarization in our country. First of all, what's your understanding of Nigeria and how polarized we are as a people?
Well, I think for me, Nigeria is an incredibly diverse country. As you said, around 250 ethnic groups, hundreds of languages, regional identities, religious identities, ethnicity, the axis of self-definition and identity are so varied and so many. But I think that fundamentally, when we discuss polarization, I do not believe that Nigerians, for example, viscerally hate each other. I don't believe that when you go to markets, when you go to public places, whether you're in the market or in the stadium or anywhere really, what you find is that the social reality of Nigeria is one of integration. People are constantly engaging with each other, whether for economic reasons, they are trading with each other, people are traveling across the country, and all of that. However, while we could say that there is a reasonable measure of social and economic integration, I believe that the tensions that we are describing when we reference polarization have to do largely with politics, with the political economy, particularly with a political economy that has made identity a key of access to social and economic opportunity. So, for example, while you did mention ethnicity and religion and all of those kind of things, one of the more significant divides in Nigeria is the divide between indigenes and settlers, as we call them. It's a divide that may be based on religion or based on ethnicity, depending on where you are, but it's a reality across the Federation. It's happening everywhere. And that is largely not because those that call themselves indigenes hate those that they believe to be settlers, but because the political economy has made it in such a way that the status of indigenship is a key of access to social and economic opportunity. It may be public education, it may be access to jobs in the state government bureaucracy, where you hear that indigenes can get jobs, but non-indigenes can't get jobs, that kind of thing. So, my overall summation of our situation is that while we are a diverse country, Nigerians do not viscerally hate each other. The evidence suggests that there's a considerable measure of social and economic integration. However, because of the way the political economy has designed identity to be a key of access to social and economic opportunity, you will have tensions, grievances around who gets what. So a lot of these issues are also distributive conflicts, where groups are measuring themselves against each other in terms of who got what. And more importantly, perhaps, the zero-sum characterization of such conflicts, which is to say that a group believes that if group A got something, then it means group B will lose something. Yes, so that's the zero-sum nature of things, that in order for one group to profit, another group must lose something. It has to suffer. So that, for me, is my general sense.
So if I get you correctly, would you say that, the issues around identity and the political economy around it has been weaponized, in essence, so that, people can have political gains and all of that, but naturally Nigerians are not quite, polarized on any fundamental ground, so to speak?
Absolutely. I would say, first, as every diverse society in the world must deal with tensions that come from difference, that come from variety. So you manage that. And of course, we have had our own encounters, our own fair share of that. But my sense is that because partly because we're a rapidly urbanizing society, more and more Nigerians are growing up in places where they are interacting with people that do not necessarily speak their language and all of that. People are growing up in more metropolitan urban spaces and all of that. And historically, our peoples have always had a very rich history of traveling, of trade and travel. Even before Nigeria came to be in this very geographical space, people were trading very freely and moving around very freely. What has happened, however, is that the political economy creates conditions under which it becomes profitable to mobilize identity and identity-based grievances for political gain, like you rightly said. So somebody you might find, for example, that in an election campaign, someone who's trying to mobilize votes may begin to highlight identity-based grievances or even invent them where necessary, or capitalize on actual, genuine, existing grievances. You know,
to romanticize them to a fault.
Precisely. In ways that, you know, ultimately, you know, poison the public mind, but will gain him some
political
capital, as it were.
Right, interesting. But can we actually excuse, you know, historical experiences and collective memory from how people see themselves, or, you know, the identity that people have built of themselves, and particularly Igbo people, because that's our focus majorly here. We're in the Southeast, and the Igbo have some sort of collective identity, whether it's been romanticized over time, right? Some of the historical events that have shaped our identity, or whether it's been, you know, weaponized, like you've said. Some people would totally reinvent, you know, experiences just to gain some sort of leverage, you know, depending on what their intentions and motives are. When we talk about Igbo identity today, how much of that identity is actually shaped by real historical experiences and collective memory?
To a great extent, but every identity, every ethnic identity, every national identity is a product of history, and the Igbo identity is not different. But one of the ways in which we must also understand identity, I think, is to recognize that identity is not static. And if you go back maybe over 100 years, 120 years, if you go back even to the early 20th century, the Igbo identity as we know it today did not exist. And what I mean by that is that predominantly people from the Southeast did not think of themselves as an Igbo collective. They thought of themselves as somebody from Obosi or somebody from Aro, Abiriba. You know, they thought of themselves in terms of city-states. And this is why town unions were such a powerful political force in the early 20th century in the Southeast in Igbo land. The creation of Igbo identity, the forging of an Igbo collective identity, was partly the work of Nnamdi Azikiwe's emergence, or the byproduct of his emergence in the early 20th century as the paramount political figure from the East, and ultimately he became Nigeria's first president. But it was also cemented further by the trauma of pre-Civil War events, as well as the Civil War itself. All of those things bonded these different groups, different Igbo subgroups together, you know. And then the Igbo identity post-Civil War now emerged. So I say all that to simply say
it's not static.
Yes, it is not static, and that if you go back 100, 120 years, you will find people that had far more. In fact, their self-definition was, "I am from this town." You know, as again, they didn't think of themselves as part of a larger Igbo collective. That came later. But absolutely, the Igbo identity is, as you would expect, very much a product of the unique historical experiences that it has suffered. And just for the sake of clarity, the Igbo identity itself is not unique in that sense. If you go back the same time period, over 100 years, there was no collective Yoruba identity either. They referred to themselves, they were primarily either from Oyo or Ibadan or Jesha or, you know, Abeokuta or Ife. The Yoruba identity, as we know it, was largely the byproduct of the rise of Obafemi Awolowo. And of course, all the work that went in from people like Samuel Ajayi Crowther when he created a common Yoruba language based on his work as a linguist. The same process happened in the Southeast because Thomas Dennis was credited with creating a lexicon of English to Igbo translation. So when you hear of Union Igbo, which I'm sure you heard, is the common Igbo that everybody speaks. That was what created a pan-Igbo identity, as against the numerous sub-dialects that, you know, existed with other local communities where people felt a much stronger sense of belonging. But you are absolutely correct in saying that the Igbo identity, as we know it, is very much a product of its unique historical circumstances.
All right, interesting. So when we, had those city-states identities, for instance, as in the Igbo, we also must have had, differences or places where these city-states clashed and thought themselves to be unique from the other city-states, and those kind of narratives that we see now with the Igbo collective identity as against maybe the Ijaw collective identity also existed on, a more I don't know how to put it, at a lower level than what we see now,
Yeah.
Interesting. So, one question I would like to ask is a strong Igbo identity a product of, polarization? Is it possible that one could have a strong Igbo identity and eschew polarization from it? You identify you're Igbo, you're from the southeast, you identify with all, the cultural uniqueness that makes you Igbo without also being, juxtaposed or against any other ethnic identity, so to speak.
Absolutely. Pride in one's ethnic heritage is not synonymous with hatred of other ethnic identities.
Okay.
It is entirely possible to be proudly Igbo, as and to be also proudly Nigerian, or to even, of course, have an appreciation of humanity.
Yeah.
I would go so far as to say that even within Igbo moral traditions, you do have these ideas of coexistence.
Yeah.
Live
and
let the hawk perch and let the eagle perch. Also, all of that tells us that within the Igbo traditional, within Igbo moral and ethical traditions, there's a real belief in diversity, in plurality. So it's never been the case that being proudly Igbo automatically means that one must hate other people or other groups. That's not the case at all.
Okay, so let's get back to some of the historical events that major events that have shaped how Igbo identity of the present has come about, because we understand that it's still going to evolve with time, and we know that maybe events or narratives would shape how that the direction that evolution takes. But very major events like the Nigeria Civil War and the Biafra experience are always pointed to by scholars to say this is one of the major events that has shaped how Igbo see themselves today, post the Civil War. How significant is the memory of the Nigeria Civil War and the Biafra experience in shaping the contemporary Igbo perceptions of Nigeria now?
I think it's been significant to the extent that even though the majority of Southeasterners that were not today, that alive today, were not alive during the Civil War, and yet the memory of the Civil War does continue to loom large in their minds. Obviously, I think you have the issue of inherited narratives. Obviously, if you were not present for something that happened 50 years ago, then what you have is inherited narratives, so to say. So it is significant, and I don't think that is surprising, because it was a traumatic event. It was a defining national trauma. Many of the national institutions we have today emerged from the post-Civil War era, and the thinking was we need to do something to ensure that this war does not repeat itself. Something like this never again happens. So it is definitely a significant event, both for the nation, but also much for Igbos as well.
All right. So how do you think that the Nigerian state has, treated the Civil War thing? Because I was reading something that said, the experiences during the Civil War were different for those in the Southeast, for those in the Southwest, for those in the North, for those in the Middle Belt and all whatnot. It was a totally different experience. So when you're trying to tell the stories, there is, that difficulty in understanding the unique experiences of these individuals. Some people might, wave off things that you think and consider very serious, right? And some other people might think that you're trivializing something that is very emotional for them. How has the Nigerian state treated, the historical wounds of the Civil War, so to speak, for Ndibo, and how can healing begin? Because a lot of people talk about healing when you talk about the Nigerian Civil War and how Igbo see themselves in the Nigerian project as of today.
I think if you go back to the immediate post-Civil War era, there was a real concerted effort to engage in peace building, post-Civil War peace building, post-Civil War reconciliation. Of course, we all know about no victor, no vanquished. We know about the 3 R's and all of that. A host of integrative institutions were established after the war with the idea of really fostering social cohesion and really trying to, weld together this very diverse society into a more coherent polity. Of course, programs like the NYSC, programs like Unity Schools, even the idea of federal character, these were things that emerged after the war. Within 9 years after the end of the Civil War, it was significant that by the time we got to 1979, at the onset of the Second Republic, all the political parties had Igbos as running mates, all of them. In fact, I think with the sole exception of the Nigeria People's Party, whose running mate was Nnamdi Azikiwe, whose presidential candidate was Nnamdi Azikiwe. And ultimately, the NP and the National Party of Nigeria won that election, and Alex Ekweme became vice president as a result. Very rarely would you find societies that have undergone war, and then you see that kind of rapid reintegration politically. Secondly, there was reabsorption. There was a reabsorption of former officers of the Nigerian military that had fought on the Biafran side. Of course, they lost rank for the years that they were, on the other side during the war, but they were absorbed back into the military. Wow. To the extent that somebody like, I think Commodore Ebitu retired, who was vice president in a military sense now. First, he was General Babangida's first deputy. Actually fought during the Civil War. Rear Admiral Alice Mbadweke fought during the Civil War. There's a generation of Igbo military officers who haven't fought on the other side were reabsorbed. They did lose rank. The same process happened in the civil service, where you had civil servants that had moved to the Biafran side during the war. Then when they came back, they were reabsorbed, but they lost seniority. So there have been things done by the federal government to absorb, or at least to try and address these issues. And I think you will find that probably the high point of those efforts was probably between the 1970s and the 80s. Now, were those efforts perfect? Absolutely not. There are many instances where people would say this did not quite work out. Certainly the 3 R's was not as expansive or as comprehensive as it should have been. Reconstruction in the Southeast was not as thorough and as comprehensive. That's reconstruction now of physical infrastructure, being that the Southeast bore the brunt of that conflict. It was not as comprehensive as it should have been. But on the whole, my sense is that when I've looked at these things and studied other instances of civil conflict and post-Civil War reconstruction, post-conflict reconstruction
across the globe,
rarely is it perfect. It is always an ongoing process. It's something that every generation of leadership keeps investing in. I would say probably one area where we've been very lacking have been in the narrative itself, in terms of, gaining an understanding of the Civil War. It's not, many people don't understand it or don't know about it. They did not encounter it in school and all of that. And that has created a void that can be filled with much more simplistic or even perverse narratives around the conflict.
Okay. So, with the way we have not, as a nation, tried to, institutionally tell the story of the Nigerian Biafra War, maybe some people will tell it from their own perspective, and their prisms could be very narrow as to, compared to what generally has happened. And, it's interesting that you've talked about how reintegration was something that the Nigerian state tried to do for the Igbos, and it was very rapid. Immediately after the Civil War, we had people from Igbo extraction who were contesting and, contesting for presidency and other, exalted positions in politics, and they were integrated as much as possible. Even if some people believe that those efforts have not yielded the necessary results, some people would say it's the trauma that has not healed. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think, yes, there's partly an issue of trauma. Conflicts will always be that. Civil wars tend to do that. So there is conflict-induced trauma. I would also say that the narratives that have been promoted about the conflicts and about the aftermath of the conflicts have probably been the most important vectors of these long enduring grievances. And I'll give an example. The typical narrative post the Civil War, or not even post the Civil War, but in more recent times, when we talk about the place of the Igbo within the Nigerian collective, within the Nigerian Federation, is one of victimhood, one that casts the Igbos as victims, beginning from the Civil War, the defeats, the traumas, the enduring traumas of all of that, and how they've been relegated, so to say. I think the more popular word for it is marginalization.
Marginalized now, yeah.
People are marginalized, and a sense of being oppressed. The Fanny Midwife, narrative. But I look at history differently, and I do not see a narrative of victimhood. What I see is a narrative of resilience, that a group that was in this conflict, and the conflict was tragic for everyone concerned, but this group not only survived, it reconstituted itself, it rebuilt its communities, it came back to a point where it became very much a thriving force within Nigeria's social economy, And for me, I look at that and I say there's something admirable about this. There's something remarkable about this. It speaks to the resilience of spirit, the strength of character. And that story, that narrative has been secondary. It's always been about
the marginalization and all.
And so on.
So how much of that marginalization narrative, or the suspicion between Igbos and other Nigerian groups, how much of it is based off of lived experiences, and how much is about all of the inherited narratives that we know, like we say in common Nigerian parlance, they've added salt and pepper to it to make stories sound interesting enough, because the history sometimes needs accuracy in its narration, instead of trying to infuse sentiments to it to make it appeal to the people that you're telling the story. How much of that suspicion between Igbo and some other Nigerian groups is based off of lived experiences, and how much is of inherited narratives and stereotypes?
I think a significant chunk of it has to do with inherited narratives and stereotypes. But there are historical experiences that obviously within the collective memory, these are things that happened for a fact, right? I think the real issue is where we fail to recognize that time has moved as well, that time has moved on. This is not the 1950s, it's not the 1960s. And the challenge is facing Igbo within Nigeria is not the same as it was back then. So a significant chunk of it, in my view, would be inherited narratives or perversions of things that actually did happen. The saying that the best lie is a half-truth. It's often a half-truth. It is possible to take actual things that did happen. But my argument has always been that you cannot go into history and look for absolute victims and absolute villains. When you take the Civil War, for example, if you're from the South, the tendency is that you're more familiar with a narrative that positions you as a victim of federal forces. But if you go to the Niger Delta, to the South, in many renditions of the history, in those parts, the Biafrans were the villains of the story, and they were the victims. So this is the nature of history and memory, it is often contested, and war is a conflict. Right? So I would say that when we look at what is happening today, a lot of it, in my view, is about inherited. It's largely about inherited narratives, inherited stereotypes, and all of that.
Yeah.
Often thrive also again because we haven't really sought out to take ownership in the national sense of the Civil War and post-Civil War narratives. That's what I would say to that.
Yeah, some people would say look at Rwanda, how they've owned, the stories around the Hutu Tutsi crisis that rocked the nation at some point. And, talking about collective memory, I read somewhere that the collective memory is not so much on how, communities remember things that happened, but more of how they interpret and pass down what's actually happened to them.
Very true. Absolutely very true.
Yeah. Let's open up the phone lines and see if we can get in questions. If you're just joining us, this is Storytelling for Unity, which is brought to you by the Active Citizen Project with support from the Ford Foundation. Today on the program, we are trying to understand polarization in Nigeria and look at how historical events and collective memory shapes Igbo identity and belonging in today's Nigeria. What are your thoughts? What are your questions? You can join the conversation this evening. You can call in or send in a message on WhatsApp. We'll be here to take those calls. 0916 000 4945 0916 000 4945. You can send in a message on WhatsApp 091 28945945 091 28945945 for WhatsApp messages. For calls again 0916 0004945. I'll just come back to you while we wait for the calls. Do you think that there is, prospects for Igbo people that they are not seeing because of those narratives that have been passed down historically? Do you think that there is a lot of prospect for Igbo people? Because on a daily basis, I interact with people on the radio, and some of them have entirely lost faith in the Nigeria project because they believe particularly that Igbo people are persecuted. And there are some other people who would call from other parts of the country or who are, of other ethnic groups, and they call in and say we are not even being treated better. In fact, the Igbos have it better than us in the Middle Belt, for instance, or the smaller ethnic, the ethnic minorities. I mean, Igbo is part of the tripod, right? The bigger three tribes that predominates the Nigerian landscape, but there are other smaller tribes that feel quite insignificant. Do you think that there are prospects for the Igbo people that they are not seeing because of these narratives?
As I said, I think if once the narrative of victimhood became predominant rather than that of resilience, then it was always going to, I think, color, the lenses through which we look at reality. The fact is that after the war, there was a recovery. And you now have in many places outside of the Southeast, I mean, I'm sure you've heard of this before, where people would say that the arguably larger share of Igbo enterprise, the wealth of Igbo enterprise is not in the Southeast, it's outside of the Southeast, it's in other parts of this country.
Yes.
So I think that there are prospects. There definitely are prospects. The second is that I do not believe, for example, that you have a situation where you have a vision of Igbos. And why you have people from other groups constantly arguing against that is because everybody, almost every Nigerian, barring those that belong to perhaps the 1%, the privileged 1%, will always be able to point at an incident or something, some way in which they are marginalized, some way in which they are ill-treated. Ultimately, what we are dealing with is lack of security that inheres in like this. Will tell you we don't.
Can you speak up, please, so that we can hear you clearly? Good evening to you.
I nearly did.
Okay, we are struggling to hear you, sir. Please do well to call back. The number is 0916 000 4945 0916 000 4945. You can send in a message on WhatsApp 091 28945 Hello, good evening. Hello?
Good evening.
Yeah, good evening.
I called back.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So, what I want to do is, why is it that we have been this?
All right, Chinedu, I have to let you go. I'm really struggling to hear you. Please do well to maybe move around and call back. Hello, good evening.
Hello,
Yeah, good evening.
hello.
Okay, Okudile, welcome. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Go ahead.
Okay. My question is that why is it that our people say that we are marginalized, but almost all our investments are outside, inside the country, but from the north, from the west. Why? But we are claiming that we are marginalized. And another thing is that why is it that our people, the politicians, they don't want us to, can I say that they don't want us to be a president and all this thing, and they don't want to allow us to go? Is it that they have something that they do in Igbo that they go Biafra to be up to state? Why? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Okudile, for joining us. 0916 0004945. Hello, good evening. Hello, good evening.
Hello.
Yes, good evening. Turn down the volume on your radio sets, please. Oh no, do well to call back 0916 0004945. Send in a message on WhatsApp 09128945945. Hello, good evening.
Good evening, Yagazie.
Yeah, good evening, sir.
My name is John Bull. I'm calling from Enugu.
Welcome.
Okay, so my thing is simple. Yeah, I first of all want to appreciate your guys. Done a pretty good job in analyzing the Nigerian situation, but we must not always lose sight of the fact that if the people are not one, you cannot force them to be one. So the Nigerian situation is
Hello?
people by constantly creating the impression that maybe the good or the outer dollar is and all that. But for me, it is not an impression that is being created. It is what we say in Kola Palace, they play, they show. The Nigerian nation is currently not one, has never been one from day one, even prior to independence. The Northerners were needy for independence. They asked the Southeasterners to go. It's a forced marriage that we are still continuing to force here. I think it is time for that very big national question to be asked. Should we continue to exist as one nation? On what terms are we existing? Even the Soviet Union were at some point forced to be on one bed together. At some point broke up. Today, new alliances are being formed with Russia, but they are still not one country.
All right.
So you cannot force strange bedfellows to sleep at the same bed night after night, even when they have given each other so much injury, and you are still asking them to stay. So if
Hello? Hello?
so,
all right, thank you. I think your point is made. Let's see if we can get in one or two more calls. 0916 0004945. Hello, good evening. Hello, good evening. All right, not ready for us. 0916 0004945. We're running out of time. Call in and get on with expressing yourself. Hello, good evening.
hello.
Yeah, good evening, sir.
Yeah, I'm just here. Okay.
Your name again, please.
I am just here. Okay, calling from Enugu.
Okay, JC Aneke, go ahead.
Yeah. It seems like some people do not understand what marginalization is all about. Like a caller before the last caller was asking the question, why do we think or
say that we are marginalized, while some of us are having our investment in the north and the west. As an individual, you can invest anywhere in the world as far as the business atmosphere there is conducive for you to do that. But in the real color of it, Igbos are being marginalized. If you say that Igbos are not being marginalized, that means you are not listening to the everyday news and events that is happening. Why is it difficult that an Igbo man cannot be the president of Nigeria? Why is it that Igbo man cannot hold most of the sensitive ministerial appointment or military appointment? Is because they don't want them to be there. That is what marginalization.
So when you say they, who do you mean they? They don't want them to be there.
I mean, what I mean there is that from 1950 till date, there is an alliance, a very mutual one going on between the North and the West.
All right.
Lead up to this movement.
All right.
You understand?
All right.
So thank you.
All right. Thank you for joining us. I think that's as much as we can take. We'll get back to you, Mr. Chris. A couple of calls that we have taken, and you can already see the reflection of the mindset of the people with regards to this issue of marginalization and being subjugated and all whatnot. John Paul said, let's not lose sight of the lack of the fact that we are not one, in his own words, that we are strange bedfellows that are put together as a nation. And then JC Aneke talked about the question of why Igbos have never become president of Nigeria, that there is a conspiracy against that. I don't know if the ethnic man who may not have been president of Nigeria would also think in that regard. But yeah, with what they have said so far, is there anything that you would say in response to that?
Yeah, I think there's so much to get into, but let me start with some of the issue of narratives.
Yeah,
a narrative of victimhood can also become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and I'll give one simple example. In the last 6 years, the southeastern states have not been able to meet their quota of recruitment into the police and into the military. Right? That is, each state has a quota that it is meant to fill. So maybe a state maybe you say a state should have 400, you should be able to get 400 recruits from there, and you get there and it's only 30 people or 40 people and all of that. So in the last 6 years, southeastern states have not been able to meet their recruitment quota into the police and into the armed forces. This is significant just because among other things, because of what this fellow, one of the last callers just referenced when he said, why don't Igbos hold sensitive positions?
Yeah.
10 years or 15 years from now, I imagine that you'll be looking at the leadership of the armed forces, and you will probably arrive at a situation where there's no Igbo person there, simply because just in terms of numbers, based on this trend that we're seeing, you do not have enough people in the pool for leadership selection. That will not be anybody's fault. That will not be anybody marginalizing you. That will be you marginalizing yourself.
Yeah, the choices you've made in the past.
The choices that have been made. So there's a way in which this marginalization thing becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Secondly, when you look at the Southeast, voter turnout in the Southeast, historically, among the zones, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, have been among the lowest.
Yeah.
So the issue is simply this. If you are a politician running for national office, would you invest in a place where voter turnout is low, or would you invest in a place where voter turnout is comparatively higher?
Yeah.
And if you look at the coalitions that have been, the ruling coalitions of this country, the last caller, I think, made a point about the North and the West. But it's important to note that in the First Republic, the coalition was actually between the North and the East. In the Second Republic, it was also between the North and the East. The West has always been in the opposition, historically.
Yeah.
So that is not even accurate. But the point is that in present-day Nigeria, when you take a political map of Nigeria and you look at where you are likely to get votes from, the Southeast does not exactly announce itself. And if a national political operator is looking at this simply, very unsentimentally, looking at where he can get votes, logic would dictate that he should invest those efforts elsewhere. Now, if you create a political coalition based on this, it's not a mystery as to why you might find that natives of the Southeast are not getting plum positions. In politics, patronage would reward those that come from the coalition strongholds. You are not in the coalition stronghold. It has nothing to do with hatred of the people, as it were. It is just the raw reality of the political map, the political geography of Nigeria. That can be changed if you have a movement that is dedicated to building the right coalitions, if there's a movement dedicated to also mobilizing the votes that you have within the region. So this is a purely political thing at this point. It doesn't speak to systemic discrimination or anything like that. No, this is about the reality of the political geography that we have.
All right, just so we wrap this up. Moving forward, if Nigeria wants to reduce polarization, right, should we be trying to maybe make Nigerians forget their painful histories like Igbo and how they would refer to the Biafra War and what was done to Igbos in the pogrom and all of that? Should we be trying to forget those painful histories, or should we be teaching ourselves to, remember these histories differently? I know you've touched on that a little bit, but just...
I think we should remember. It's not about forgetting. When we forget or when we are, because they are unforgettable, right? This is why a generation that didn't see the war carries, still talks in these terms. We have to accept, even embrace these parts of our history. All diverse countries, all societies have conflict. All diverse societies have conflict. The real key is how do you manage that, the conflict itself and its aftermath. How do you also manage the memory of that conflict? And I think that this is probably the area where we have been weakest in all our post-Civil War efforts or in all our peacebuilding efforts. It's the memory, handling memory, managing memory. And we have to become much better at that. This means teaching this to people in school. And when we explore history, we are not exploring it because we are trying to damn people or condemn a group or, blame people for something. But what we are trying to do is to come to terms with this. As I pointed out earlier, when you read the Civil War, if you look at narratives around the Civil War, memoirs, in fact, I would recommend, if you read Ken Saro-Wiwa's book on A Darkling Plain, it's a very different take on the Civil War. It does not reflect at all Biafrans as the heroes of that story. To Ken Saro-Wiwa and his people, Biafrans were the villains. But that is exactly my point. That in a conflict you have different sides, and you will find people that say, oh, this person is the villain, that person is the victim, and all of that. I think that this is about historical recollection, owning the history. Secondly, we have to memorialize it, and by that I mean, even here in the Southeast, there's no monument to the Civil War. Just something that reflects Ozoalor. And Ozoalor was always the idea that this was a tragedy. We didn't even bother to blame anybody. We just said this is a tragedy. Can we ensure that it doesn't happen again? So something like that as well, something that memorializes that tragedy in a way that tells us we don't want to do this again. You talked about Rwanda. That's one of the things they did in Rwanda. You have the Genocide Museum of Rwanda, and the whole point of it is we don't want to ever repeat this pain, this horror in our history. So I think that these are some of the things we can do. The third thing is, I would say, we need to decriminalize historical relics and symbols of the Civil War. What do I mean by that? The more we drive certain symbols underground, the more we ban, for example, the flag. And it's not even clear to me that it is even legally, that is in a very formal sense. These things are criminalized. Then when we talk about what we call the Biafran flag, the symbol of the rising sun and all of those things, we must recognize that these are historical relics. If you drive them underground by purporting to ban them, you give them much greater symbolic power. The best thing you can do is to let those things be free for everybody to see. They are historical relics, they are memorabilia. And what they do is that they tell us about our history. But if you drive them underground, you give them an almost mystical potency that non-state actors and extremists can use for mobilization. When you go to the US, you see the Confederate flag around. Nobody is talking about resurrecting the Confederate Union that tried to secede from the US. So simply because a symbol exists does not mean that it is automatically some form of treason. Or so we must be able to recognize what is part of our history and to accept it. And in doing so, you will find that you demystify it. And then history ceases to be something that polarizes. It becomes a point of learning. There's a lot to learn from the tragic events of that period.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chris Ngwodo. It's been very interesting and insightful listening to you today. Some of the take-homes for me is that identity is not static, and then the narrative of victimhood can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's something that I would like us as people, everybody who's had this today, should ruminate on that and think deeply about those words, right? And then ask themselves very pertinent questions. Thank you so much, sir. Mr. Chris Ngwodo is the Pioneer Director General of the Office for Strategic Preparedness and Resilience, Nigeria's national early warning center in the Office of the Vice President. The agency is an affiliate of the ECOWAS Regional Peace and Security Architecture and is mandated to address threats to human security. He previously served as the Senior Special Assistant to the President on Policy Research and as Technical Assistant to the President on Justice, Security and Conflict Prevention in the Office of the Vice President. Throughout his career, he has addressed issues of conflict development, governance, national security, and geostrategic affairs. Thank you so much, sir. It's a wrap on Storytelling for Unity, the second episode. Look forward to the third episode next week, Thursday, right here on Urban Radio 94.5 FM. Good evening.